started with small things. Things you could ignore if you weren't looking for them. One day, Mr. Harlan wouldn't wave back when you greeted him. The next, you'd notice his lawn overgrown, his once pristine porch cluttered with junk. But life moved fast, and no one thought much of it. Harlan had been a quiet man for years, living on the corner of Brookfield Drive in a house with white shutters and a perfectly maintained garden. He and his wife, Lynn, had moved in about a decade ago with their daughter, Emily. They were friendly, polite, and just distant enough to not make anyone feel obligated to be more than passing acquaintances. Then Emily got sick. She'd been just 10 years old when she passed. A rare illness that no amount of treatment could cure. It was a tragedy that rippled through the neighborhood. But life moved on. Then, 2 years later, Lynn died in a car crash on the highway just outside town. After that, Mr. Harlan changed. At first, it was subtle. He stopped talking to anyone. The once vibrant house became drab. The garden left to wither. But people chalked it up to grief. Who wouldn't fall apart after losing their family? It wasn't until last winter, when the lights in his house stayed on for 3 days straight, that people started to notice something was off. And then the screaming started. It was faint at first, barely audible over the hum of life on the street. But if you were outside after dark, you could hear it. A man's voice, raw and agonized, echoing from inside Harlan's home. People whispered about it at neighborhood cookouts and PTA meetings. Some suggested calling the police, but no one wanted to get involved. Until the morning the cat appeared. It was a Sunday. The sun was just rising, and the street was quiet. I was taking out the trash when I saw it. A black cat lying motionless in the middle of Harlan's driveway. At first I thought it had been hit by a car. But as I got closer, I realized its neck had been twisted at an unnatural angle, and its fur was matted with blood. I backed away, my stomach turning. Later that afternoon, a few of us gathered in our front yards, talking about what we'd seen. Maybe it was an accident, Mrs. Givens suggested, though her voice wavered. Accident, Mr. Colby scoffed, shaking his head. That cat didn't just fall over dead. Somebody did that. Nobody said it, but we were all thinking the same thing. A few days later, someone spray-painted "Monster" on Harlan's garage door. The word stayed there for a week before he painted over it. After that, the whispers about him grew louder. People said they'd seen him digging in his backyard late at night, that they'd heard him muttering to himself at the grocery store. But it wasn't until the night of the break-in that things took a darker turn. It was a Wednesday. The air was bitterly cold, and most of the street had turned in early. I was up late, grading papers in the living room when I heard the first sound. A faint crash, like glass breaking. I froze, listening. A few seconds later, I heard it again, louder this time. It was coming from Harlan's house. I moved to the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to see the faint glow of his porch light. Then I saw the shadow. Someone was moving through his yard. Their figure illuminated briefly as they passed by the light. They were holding something, a bat, maybe, or a crowbar. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my heart pounding as I described what I'd seen. The dispatcher assured me someone was on the way, and I hung up, glancing out the window again. The shadow was gone. I waited, my stomach in knots, until the flashing lights of a patrol car lit up the street. 2 officers stepped out, their hands resting on the holsters at their sides as they approached Harlan's front door. They knocked, calling out his name. No answer. After a moment, one of them tried the handle. The door creaked open. What happened next has been replayed in my mind 1,000 times. The officers disappeared inside, their flashlights sweeping through the house. Then there was shouting, angry, frantic shouting, followed by the unmistakable sound of a struggle. Seconds later, the 2 officers stumbled out, dragging Harlan between them. His face was pale, his eyes wild, and he was covered in dirt. He was shouting something, his voice hoarse and broken, but I couldn't make out the words. The officers shoved him into the back of the patrol car and drove away, leaving the rest of us to stand in our yards, staring at each other in shock. What had he been doing in there? The answer came the next morning when the police tape went up around his house. They'd found something in his basement, something they wouldn't talk about, But later, when the rumors started, we learned the truth. And none of us ever looked at Harlan or each other the same way again. The police didn't share much about what they'd found in Harlan's house that night, but the rumors spread quickly. By the next morning, a forensics van was parked in his driveway, and uniformed officers were going in and out of the house, their faces pale and tight-lipped. From my window, I could see one of them carrying out a box, sealed tightly with tape. Behind him, another officer followed, clutching what looked like a bundle of clothes, wrapped in clear plastic. The sight made my stomach churn. That afternoon, the entire neighborhood was buzzing with speculation. "I heard they found blood," Mrs. Givens whispered, clutching her coat tightly as we stood on the sidewalk. "Blood," Mr. Colby scoffed. "They found more than that. My buddy at the station said the basement floor was covered in it." I stared at him, my heart pounding. "Covered?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded grimly, said it looked like someone had been butchering animals down there. "But here's the thing," he leaned in closer. "They didn't find any bodies, just the blood." The words sent a chill down my spine. The whispers grew darker as the day went on. Someone claimed they'd seen a police officer vomiting in the bushes outside Harlan's house. Another said the officers had found dozens of photographs pinned to the basement walls, photos of people on our street. The idea made my skin crawl. That night I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside made my heart race. By midnight I'd given up on sleep entirely. I sat in the living room with the lights off, staring out the window at the faint glow of Harlan's porch light. It was still on even though the house was empty, or so I thought. Just after 1 a.m., I saw movement. A figure stepped into view, silhouetted against the glow of the porch light. For a second, I thought it was Harlan. The shape was familiar, the hunched shoulders, the slow, deliberate movements. But then I remembered, Harlan was in police custody. The figure moved across the yard, pausing near the side of the house. I grabbed my phone, dialing 911 with trembling fingers. "There's someone in Harlan's yard," I whispered, keeping my eyes on the figure. "They shouldn't be there." The dispatcher assured me they'd send someone, but by the time the patrol car arrived, the figure was gone. The officers swept the yard with flashlights but found nothing. One of them approached my door, his expression weary. "Probably just a drifter," he said when I explained what I'd seen. "But we'll keep an eye on it." I nodded, though his words didn't comfort me. The next morning, I found something on my porch, a small wooden box, stained dark and slightly damp. I hesitated before opening it, my hands shaking. Inside was a bundle of hair, tied together with a thin black ribbon. Underneath it was a photograph, faded and slightly torn. It was of me sitting in my living room, my breath caught in my throat. The photo had been taken last night. I called the police immediately, my voice trembling as I explained what I'd found. They arrived quickly, taking the box and the photo as evidence. But their questions made it clear they didn't know what to make of it. "Could it be someone else on the street?" one of them asked. "I don't know," I said, shaking my head. "But whoever it is, they were watching me." The officer's expression darkened, but he didn't say anything. That night, the nightmares started. I dreamt of the basement, even though I'd never been inside it. In the dream, the walls were covered in photographs, each one of a different neighbor. And in the center of the room was Harlan, his hands dripping with blood, his eyes wild and unblinking. I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat. The house was silent, but the feeling of being watched was suffocating. I checked the locks on the doors and windows, double-checking each one before crawling back into bed. But as I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next morning, I found out I wasn't the only one. Mrs. Givens had found a similar box on her porch, this one containing a blood-stained piece of fabric. Mr. Colby reported hearing scratching at his windows during the night, though he hadn't seen anyone outside. The entire street was on edge, the unease spreading like wildfire. And then, 2 days later, a neighbor disappeared. When the police searched his house, they found the front door wide open and a single note pinned to the kitchen table. It read, You didn't listen. After Mr. Ellis disappeared, the street was never the same. He had lived 2 houses down from me, a retired schoolteacher who spent most of his time gardening or walking his dog. Nobody could understand why he'd been targeted. The police searched his house and questioned the neighbors, but no one had seen or heard anything unusual. The only clue was the note left on his table. You didn't listen. It was a cryptic message that left everyone uneasy. What hadn't we listened to? Who was behind this? But deep down, we all knew who the prime suspect was. Even though Harlan was still in custody, his shadow loomed over the neighborhood. The stories about his basement grew darker with every retelling. Some said the blood on the floor had soaked into the concrete. Others claimed the photographs they'd found weren't just of us. They were of us sleeping. I tried to ignore the rumors, but the unease gnawed at me. And then the noises started. It was late, well past midnight, when I first heard it. A faint tapping sound, like fingers drumming against glass. I froze, sitting up in bed and straining to hear. The sound came again, louder this time. It was coming from the window. My stomach dropped as I grabbed my phone and crept toward the window. I pulled the curtain back just enough to peek outside, my breath fogging up the glass. The street was dark and empty, the faint glow of the streetlights barely illuminating the sidewalks. But just as I was about to turn away, I saw it. A figure standing on the sidewalk across the street. They were completely still, their face obscured by the shadows. I backed away from the window, my pulse pounding. The tapping started again, but this time it was coming from the back door. I turned, my heart racing as I moved toward the kitchen. The sound was faint but steady, like someone testing the lock. I grabbed a knife from the counter, my hands trembling. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. The tapping stopped. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, the silence pressing in around me. Then, from somewhere outside, I heard a laugh. It was low and guttural, barely loud enough to carry through the night. I ran back to my room, locking the door behind me. The police arrived 20 minutes later, but by then the figure was gone. They found nothing outside, no footprints, no signs of forced entry. One of the officers gave me a tired look. "Probably just a prank," he said, though his tone didn't sound convinced. But it didn't feel like a prank. The next morning, I found another box on my porch. This one was larger than the last, the cardboard damp and sagging slightly. I hesitated before opening it, dread pooling in my stomach. Inside was a stack of photographs. The top one was of Mr. Ellis, taken from outside his window. He was sitting at his kitchen table, completely unaware of the camera. The next photo was of me, taken from the same angle. My hands shook as I flipped through the stack, each picture more unsettling than the last. They were all of us, neighbors, friends, going about our lives, completely oblivious to the fact that we were being watched. I called the police again, but they didn't seem to know what to do. "It might be someone trying to scare you," one of them suggested. "We'll increase patrols, but without more evidence." He trailed off, and I knew what he meant. Without more evidence, they couldn't do anything. That night, I stayed awake, watching the street from my window. The hours dragged by, the silence broken only by the occasional bark of a distant dog. Around 3 a.m., I saw movement. A figure stepped into the glow of the streetlight, their face still obscured. They stood there for a moment, staring directly at my house. Then they raised a hand and waved. The next morning, 2 more neighbors were missing. And this time there were no notes. The disappearances of the Thompsons sent a ripple of panic through the neighborhood. They were a young couple, newlyweds who had just moved in a few months earlier. Their house was eerily quiet, the curtains drawn, their car still parked in the driveway. It was as if they had simply vanished. The police were all over Brookfield Drive that day, combing through every inch of the Thompsons' property. But like with Mr. Ellis, they found nothing. No signs of a struggle, no forced entry, just silence. The fear on the street was palpable. Parents wouldn't let their kids play outside, and everyone kept their curtains closed, their doors locked. But the locks didn't help. That night, the power went out. It was around 11 p.m. when the lights flickered once, twice, and then died completely. I sat in the dark, my heart pounding as I scrambled for the flashlight I kept in the kitchen drawer. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but it did little to calm my nerves. I checked the windows, peering out into the pitch-black street. The houses were dark, their silhouettes barely visible against the cloudy night sky. Then I heard it. A faint creak, like a floorboard shifting under weight. It was coming from upstairs. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I lived alone. Gripping the flashlight tightly, I moved toward the staircase, each step creaking under my weight. "Hello," I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. No response. The air felt heavy, the kind of weight that presses against your chest and makes it hard to breathe. When I reached the top of the stairs, I shone the flashlight down the hallway. The door to my bedroom was ajar. I was certain I'd closed it. Sweat trickled down my back as I approached the door, the beam of light trembling in my unsteady hand. I pushed the door open slowly, the hinges groaning in protest. The room was empty, but the window was wide open, the curtains billowing in the cold night air. I rushed to the window, shining the flashlight outside. The beam caught movement, a figure disappearing into the shadows of my backyard. I stumbled back, my heart hammering. Then I saw it. A photograph taped to the inside of the window. It was a picture of me, taken just moments earlier as I stood in the same spot. I grabbed the photo, my hands trembling as I turned it over. On the back was a single word: soon. The sound of glass breaking downstairs jolted me from my thoughts. I spun around, my flashlight beam darting across the room. Someone was inside the house. I bolted down the stairs, my heart pounding in my ears. The front door was still locked, the chain in place. But the back door was wide open, the cold night air spilling into the kitchen. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my voice shaking as I explained what had happened. The dispatcher stayed on the line, her calm voice trying to keep me grounded. "Officers are on their way," she said. "Stay on the line with me." I pressed my back against the wall, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. Every creak of the house made me jump, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. When the police arrived, they found more than I expected. The officers swept through the house, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. In the backyard, they found a set of footprints leading to the alley behind my house. And in the alley, they found a small, blood-stained bag. Inside was a knife, and another photograph. This time, it was of the Thompsons, tied up and gagged, their eyes wide with terror. The officers exchanged a look, their faces grim. "This isn't just stalking anymore," one of them said. "This is something else entirely." The discovery of the bloodstained bag and the photograph of the Thompsons turned Brookfield Drive into chaos. Police cars lined the street for days, and the sense of safety we once had was shattered. The photograph haunted me, their terrified faces, the way their bodies looked crumpled and restrained. It was seared into my mind. I couldn't stop thinking about where they were, or if they were even alive. The police worked around the clock, questioning neighbors and combing through any evidence they could find. But Harlan's involvement couldn't be ignored. Even though he was still in custody, his presence loomed over everything. It didn't make sense. How could a man locked behind bars still be pulling the strings? That night, unable to sleep, I found myself staring out the window, the photograph still lying on my kitchen counter. The street was quiet, the kind of stillness that felt unnatural. Then I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the woods, barely illuminated by the faint glow of the streetlights. They were watching my house. My breath caught, and I froze, every instinct screaming at me to turn off the lights and hide. But I couldn't look away. The figure didn't move. They just stood there, their head tilted slightly, like they were waiting for something. I finally broke free from the trance and grabbed my phone, dialing the police. By the time the officers arrived, the figure was gone. But they found something else. On my porch was another box. This one was larger, heavier, the cardboard sagging slightly under its own weight. I stepped back as the officers approached it, their gloved hands carefully lifting the lid. Inside was a bundle of fabric, dark and damp. When they unfolded it, I realized with a sinking feeling what it was. A jacket. Mr. Ellis's jacket. The officer's face hardened, and he motioned for me to step back as they examined the contents further. Beneath the jacket was a keyring, the kind you'd find in an older house, thick, brass, and rusted. And beneath the keyring was a photograph. It was of the basement in Harlan's house. The walls were lined with shelves, and on each shelf were jars. Dozens of them. Each jar was filled with something unidentifiable, preserved in a murky liquid. But the most horrifying part of the photo was the writing scrawled on the wall behind the shelves. "I'll always be here." The officers exchanged a grim look, and one of them immediately called the station. "Get someone to check the evidence logs," he said into the phone, his voice tight. I didn't understand at first. "Evidence logs?" I asked, my voice trembling. The officer sighed, his eyes weary. "When we cleared Harlan's basement, we didn't find anything like this. It wasn't there." The words sent a chill down my spine. If the jars weren't there when the police searched the basement, where were they now? And who was sending the photos? That night I barely slept. The next morning we got our answer. It was all over the news. Harlan had escaped custody. The details were vague, but the headlines were clear. "Local man accused of stalking and disappearances escapes police custody." The fear that gripped our neighborhood turned into full-blown panic. People packed their bags, some leaving town entirely. Those who stayed barricaded their doors and windows, locking themselves inside before sundown. I was no different. For days, I lived in a state of constant fear, every sound sending my heart racing. And then one night it all came to a head. I was sitting in my living room, the curtains drawn tightly, when I heard it. A knock at the door. It was soft at first, almost polite, but it quickly grew louder, more insistent. I grabbed the knife I kept on the coffee table and crept toward the door, my heart pounding. "Who is it?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. No answer. The knocking stopped. I waited, every muscle in my body tense. Then, from behind me, I heard a whisper. "You didn't listen." I spun around, the knife clutched tightly in my hand. But the room was empty. The whisper came again, this time from the hallway. I moved cautiously, the floorboards creaking under my weight. At the end of the hall, the door to my bedroom was ajar. I pushed it open slowly, the knife raised. The room was empty, but the window was open, the curtains billowing in the cold night air. On the bed was a single photograph. It was of me standing in the hallway, taken just moments earlier. As I stared at the photograph, a voice whispered behind me. "I told you I'd always be here." I stared at the photograph in my hands, my breath shallow and uneven. The image of me standing in the hallway, taken just moments ago, seemed to mock me. "How?" The voice behind me still echoed in my mind. "I told you I'd always be here." I tightened my grip on the knife and spun around, expecting to face Harlan. But the hallway was empty. The air was cold, unnaturally so, as if the open window had sucked the warmth from the house. My instincts screamed at me to run, to get out of the house and as far away as possible. But I knew he was still here, watching. The faint sound of creaking floorboards broke the silence, coming from the living room. My pulse quickened as I moved toward the noise, every step calculated, the knife trembling in my hand. The room was dark, the curtains drawn, and the only light came from the faint glow of the streetlights outside. I scanned the shadows, my breath fogging the air as I whispered, "Harlan, I know you're here." No response. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint ticking of the wall clock. Then I saw it, a figure reflected in the glass of the television screen. I spun around, raising the knife, but the figure was gone. The front door hung slightly ajar, swinging gently on its hinges. I moved cautiously toward it, my heart thundering in my chest. The cold night air seeped in through the gap, carrying with it the faint smell of pine and damp earth. When I reached the door, I paused, gripping the frame for support. The street outside was empty, the houses dark and silent. But then I noticed something on the ground just outside the door. Another photograph. This one was of my backyard, taken from the tree line. In the photo, a figure stood among the trees, half hidden by the shadows. Their face was obscured, but I recognized the shape of their shoulders, the hunch of their posture. It was Harlan. I stepped outside, the cold biting at my skin as I scanned the yard. The trees loomed like sentinels, their branches swaying gently in the wind. Then I saw him. He was standing at the edge of the yard, just beyond the reach of the porch light. "Harlan!" I shouted, my voice cracking. He didn't move, didn't flinch. He just stood there, staring. The knife felt heavy in my hand as I took a step forward, my body trembling. "What do you want from me?" I yelled, the words echoing into the night. Harlan tilted his head slightly, the motion eerily slow. Then he raised his hand and pointed at me. The gesture made my blood run cold. It wasn't a threat. It was an accusation. "I didn't do anything to you," I said, my voice shaking. He stepped forward, his face finally coming into view. His eyes were bloodshot, his skin pale and stretched tight across his face. He looked more like a ghost than a man. "You took everything from me," he said, his voice low and raspy. I froze, my mind racing. Was he confusing me with someone else? Or was this just the delusion of a broken man? "You don't belong here," he continued, his words dripping with venom. "This was my home, my family. And you." He didn't finish. Instead, he lunged. I barely had time to react, the knife flashing in the faint light as I swung it wildly. The blade caught his arm, slicing through his coat, but it didn't stop him. We crashed to the ground, his weight knocking the wind out of me. His hands closed around my wrists, slamming them against the cold earth. "You can't take what's already gone," he hissed, his face inches from mine. I twisted beneath him, using every ounce of strength I had to break free. The knife slipped from my hand, landing somewhere in the darkness. Desperation fueled me as I kicked out, catching him in the stomach. He stumbled back, giving me just enough time to scramble to my feet. I didn't look for the knife. I didn't look back. I ran. The forest swallowed me whole, the trees closing in around me as I sprinted blindly through the darkness. Behind me, I could hear him crashing through the underbrush, his ragged breaths growing louder. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of the neighborhood, the faint glow of streetlights guiding me back to safety. When I finally turned around, he was gone, but the feeling of his eyes on me never left. The police found Harlan the next morning, wandering along the highway, muttering to himself. He was taken back into custody, but the damage he'd done to the neighborhood would never be undone.